Welcome to the Key Information for DUIC Policy webinar. My name is Sue Sillick, and I'm the Research Manager at the Montana Department of Transportation. I would like to start by giving a little bit of an overview on the pooled fund study that resulted in this research. So we just recently completed last federal fiscal year, which ended September 30th, our phase 1 of our Traffic Safety Culture Pooled Fund. That was TPF 5309. We are initiating a new pooled fund for the next 5 years, federal fiscal year 2020 to 2024, and that pooled fund number is TPF 5444. So Montana leads this pooled fund, and the purpose is to really increase safety efforts on the soft side, the safety culture side, to develop tools, services to improve traffic safety culture. I've listed here the pooled fund, the two pooled fund URLs for the first phase and the second phase, and then our project page here. I just want to point out that we are still seeking partners for our new phase, federal fiscal year 2020 to 2024 for TPF 5444. So with this pooled fund, we have conducted 10 projects, 7 of which are completed, and you can see these listed here. The third one is the subject of our webinar today. The fourth one, we have a webinar scheduled for November 19th, and I've copied the URL here. And then for the fifth one, we have a webinar pending for December 3rd, and I do not have the registration link quite yet. We just decided today which day we were going to hold that. Listed here are 3 of our ongoing projects, still as a part of phase 1. That adds up to the total of 10 projects. Benefits for joining: improving traffic safety by improving traffic safety culture, leveraging funds, resources, partnering. You have a seat at the table to help guide the research that we conduct in this next phase, and others. There are many more benefits. So again, our new pooled fund is TPF 5444. We are still seeking partners, and we'd love for you to join us and help set the goals. And I have my contact information here. I'll note that we will post the presentations and the recording to our project page, and an email will be sent out to all registrants with that information. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Ward, who is going to present on our project.
Thank you, Sue.
So Nick, you wanted to show your other, you got it, perfect.
Thanks, Sue. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're excited to have such a large group here for this webinar. We'll be talking about key information about driving under the influence of cannabis. Cannabis and driving is a very interesting topic from a research perspective, but also a very complex topic from a policy perspective. So I want to walk you through some of the key information that was developed as part of this project in the pooled fund that Sue just explained. The main purpose of this project was to provide traffic safety stakeholders with an accessible document that integrates all the evidence around cannabis and traffic safety. The research in cannabis and traffic safety is spread across a lot of diverse sources. Some of them a little inaccessible and hard to digest because they're grounded in experimental design and research publications. So we were trying to pull together the consensus from these different research projects into a more accessible report for stakeholders to acquire the key information from. And in addition to the report, we also provided additional tools that would help stakeholders use this information and discuss this information within their organizations and with other stakeholders. So aside from the report, which integrated the consensus in the research, we also provided a poster with infographics to communicate some of the main information, a PowerPoint presentation that stakeholders could use to discuss some of the key information in the report, some talking points to help initiate conversations among stakeholders, and today's webinar is another part of that tool set. So we're trying to make the report more than something on the shelf. We're trying to provide tools that let stakeholders get the most out of that report and use the content to help guide their discussions and decision-making regarding traffic safety and policies with respect to cannabis. Being a complex topic, I want to be clear on what we're covering in this webinar and what we're not covering in this webinar. So in terms of what will be included in this webinar, we're going to go through a number of subtopics. The first is to talk about context. What are some of the reasons for growing interest in cannabis as a traffic safety concern? The second is looking closely at cannabis as a drug and how it differs from alcohol, and understanding some of the issues that make this topic so complex, especially around measurement of impairment with respect to cannabis versus impairment with respect to alcohol. We're also going to talk about some logic, the logic in terms of what is the sequence of the effect of cannabis, how does it affect the brain, and how does that translate into impairment of cognitive functions, and how does that show up in driving and possibly result in a change in crash risk. We're going to spend some time talking specifically what the evidence about crash risk says and doesn't say, trying to be clear on what we mean when we talk about crash risk and how we're assessing it in the literature and what it really means. And then we're going to finish off talking a little bit about what some possible effects of laws that decriminalize cannabis might have on traffic safety and society as a whole. Things we're not going to talk about is the ethics of cannabis use. We're not going to talk about whether cannabis has any medical effectiveness or not. We're not going to talk about justification for cannabis laws, and we're not going to get into policies and technologies that can be used for cannabis detection. Our real goal is to try and present the consensus within the research and not debate the results of any individual study. So for the most part, what I present going forward is the trend or the consensus in the research. We may use an individual study as an example, but we're not getting into the weeds in terms of the merits of one individual study over another. So to start, let's talk about the context. Why is there growing interest in DUIC? There's several aspects to the changing context and the growing interest in this topic. The first is access is changing. As more and more states change the laws to legalize use and sales of cannabis, cannabis is becoming more accessible to the population for both recreational and medical use. Greater access logically translates into greater use. This is some data from Sansa showing the percentage of use in the past month reported from 2002 to 2013 for everyone aged 12 and older. And what it shows is illicit drug use in general, the red line is going up, and the main reason for that is that marijuana use is increasing, the blue line. So beginning about 2007, we see an increasing trend in cannabis use amongst U.S. citizens above age 12. In contrast, the other drugs listed here, black, green, and purple, psychotherapeutics, hallucinogens, and cocaine, they are flat or declining. So it's quite interesting to note that amongst what we're calling illicit drugs, even though the laws are changing, marijuana is the one that is increasing the most, and arguably the only one that is increasing since 2007. So as access goes up, use goes up. With increased use, we would expect to see THC or cannabis present in different events in life. And here we have traffic fatalities. This is a graph showing between 1999 and 2010 the percentage of drivers killed in a crash that were tested positive for THC, which we'll talk about later as the main ingredient in cannabis. And what you see is there is an increasing trend for THC being more present in drivers killed in crashes over time. especially after 2003, we see the trends going up, especially for the youngest age group, under 25 years. But we also see an increase in the number of drivers killed testing positive for cannabis in 25 to 44, and even a slight increase for 45 to 64. Arguably, there's no trend for those over 65. So we are seeing increased use translating to increased presence in drivers killed in crashes. Along a similar line, there's a growing concern about polydrug use. This is data from Washington State provided by the Washington Traffic Safety Commission, data from 2008-2016, different drugs, THC only or cannabis only. Alcohol only is blue. Polydrug use, any combination of the drugs, is in orange, and one drug only is in gray. The orange line is the one I want you to look at. This is the polydrug line, which implies there was more than one drug in the driver killed in a fatal crash. That's been growing steadily in Washington State from 2011, and the number one combination is alcohol plus cannabis. So there's an interest not only in driving under the influence of cannabis, but also growing interest in reasons why people are combining cannabis with alcohol. And we'll touch on that briefly later in this webinar. So there's some discussion about the context of growing interest in the role of cannabis in traffic safety. Now I want to shift a bit, talk about cannabis as a drug, and in particular how it's different than alcohol. This table identifies a number of differences between cannabis and alcohol. We're using alcohol as sort of a benchmark here, given that it's the larger risk for fatal crashes as a drug, so it's a good one to compare to. It's one that we have a lot of research on, including risk curves and so forth. So comparing cannabis to alcohol, the source of the drug, cannabis comes from the plant itself, where alcohol is a result of fermentation, usually of plant material. It's interesting to note that there's only one active ingredient in alcohol, and that's ethanol, whereas in cannabis, there's at least 66 active ingredients, the main one being THC, but there are others as well, CBD, CBC, and CBG. So it's a much more complex drug in the sense that there's more active ingredients that affect the brain and the body. There's also some differences in how they are consumed. Alcohol is primarily taken orally as a drink. You could argue it's used in food too, but it tends to be burnt, the ethanol is burnt off used in the cooking process. Whereas there's many more ways that people are using cannabis. The three most popular are smoking, eating, and oral through drinks or drops taken that way too. It's important to note too that aside from having different amounts of active ingredients, alcohol versus cannabis, they also affect the brain differently. Alcohol primarily inhibits neurotransmitters within the brain, particularly GABA, which is a neurotransmitter. In contrast to that, cannabis really focuses on the endocannabinoid system connecting the receptor CB1. So they have different sites of the brain that they focus on, and they have different ways of affecting brain functioning. And lastly, they absorb into the body differently. Alcohol is soluble in water, whereas cannabis is soluble in fat, not water. So that has significant impact on how the two drugs move through the body and how long they remain in the body. As we'll talk later, cannabis, or evidence of cannabis, can stay for a while after the impairment effect because it gets absorbed by fatty tissues and has to be dispersed from there and eliminated, whereas alcohol tends to be eliminated more quickly from the body, and you tend to have a more direct association between the amount of alcohol and the amount of impairment. So they're two different drugs with two different, very different ways of affecting the body, and consequently, the way we see the effects of impairment differ between the two quite substantially. Look at some examples of the unique nature of cannabis. This is a graph showing subjective high as a function of elapsed time since consumption. And here we have a light blue graph, or a section of the graph, which is 20 milligrams of THC taken orally. The darker blue is 19 milligrams smoked, and the blacky blue is intravenous injection of 5 milligrams of THC. And you see that the way they're consumed affects the time profile of the subjective high. In particular, when taken orally, we see that there's a lower peak and that the effect lasts much longer than if it's smoked or taken intravenously. But also show in this graph that smoking versus intravenous, you get a much larger subjective high from a much smaller dose of THC if it's taken intravenously, put directly into the body, rather than being smoked, where there's some inefficiencies and the THC gets lost during the absorption process. So the method of consumption affects the presence of the drug in the body over time and how it's experienced as a subjective high. This graph shows 3 different subjects who received the same dose of THC. And this graph shows the level of THC as a function of time after consumption. And the purpose of this graph is to show that individuals may respond differently to the same dose of THC. So here we see that the THC leaves the body at different rates for different people. So the vertical lines at the bottom of the graph, A, C, and B, mark the endpoint of where the THC has been eliminated from the body for this person. And you see that person A still had THC present up to 10 hours after consumption, whereas person B, they had eliminated their THC after 4 hours. So the elimination of THC from the body has a great deal of individual variability. You could also look at the A, B, C lines on the vertical axis, the left axis, the y-axis. Different people experience a different peak THC level, even with the same dose. So we need to recognize there's a lot of individual variability in how long THC persists in the body and what the maximum peak level is, even for the same dose. This is an interesting, although complex-looking graph. This graph shows several things. First of all, it's showing subjective ratings of response to THC. The left panel is ratings of subjective high. The middle panel is ratings of subjective anxiety. And the right panel is ratings of subjective fatigue, tiredness, or sedatedness. Each panel, and let's focus on the left panel, which is subjective high, has a time graph for occasional smokers, those that smoke once in a while, smoke cannabis once in a while, and the dark blue circles are users of cannabis who frequently smoke. And the third thing I want you to notice is that for each of those lines, the dashed line of occasional users and the dark blue line for the frequent users, it has this sort of strange loop shape to it. And that is because this graph is taken over time. So if you take, for example, the dashed line on the left panel for occasional users, you see that time 0, they have no rating of high because they've just consumed it. But over time, the THC is absorbed and they start feeling a subjective high. And at some point, the THC level has been absorbed and it starts getting eliminated, so you see reductions in THC over time as it's removed from the body. That's true of also here of the frequent users. So focusing again on the left panel, I want you to focus on a few pieces of key information that shows how the effect of cannabis may be dependent on how frequently you use the drug. So first of all, this red line shows that frequent users need higher levels of THC to reach their peak high. Some people refer that as a tolerance. They've become tolerant to the effect of THC, so they need to take more to experience their peak high. The purple line shows that the peak high for occasional users is higher than frequent users. And that's true of all the graphs here. They have a higher level of high, they have a higher level of anxiousness, and they have a higher level of sedatedness. So being an occasional user, you're impacted more by the drug. And the last thing I want to show here, going back to this time loop concept, is that you can have two different ratings of high for the same THC level. In both cases, for the frequent smoker and the occasional user, you have a higher high in the second part of the phase when you reach the same THC level as it's being eliminated. So here, with the occasional users again, you have a THC of about 4 and a subjective rating of about 30 level high. And as the drug is absorbed and eliminates, you get back to 4 again, you have a much higher rating of high. So the story here is that the level of subjective experience or impairment for the same level of THC may depend on whether you're absorbing the drug or eliminating the drug. So interpreting what it means for a given THC level can mean understanding whether it's part of the absorption phase or the elimination phase, which adds complications to interpreting the potential effect of any given THC level, because it may depend on whether it's at the first part of the phase when they're absorbing or the later phase when they're eliminating THC. Now, I want to talk about tolerance specifically and provide a quote from Jan Ramakers, who's one of the major researchers on cannabis and its effects on the body, including traffic safety. There's a lot of people who try and argue that frequent users become tolerant and therefore have no impairment from cannabis. And Raymakers, having reviewed a lot of this literature, argues that this is not the case. Most often, evidence of tolerance, that is, frequent users showing no impairment effects, is a result of poor experimental design. And we'll talk about that again a bit later. Designing a poor experiment, it makes it easy to find no results. And Raymaker goes on to argue that based on the consensus in the literature, even frequent users, daily or near daily users, do show impairment that's likely to show up in everyday activities such as driving. So the notion of tolerance may be an artifact of poor design, and there is enough evidence across the literature to show that even frequent users show some degree of impairment from cannabis use. Just to finish off this conversation about the drug, there's a number of issues related to testing and measuring the drug that we should point out that adds complications to this whole conversation. The first is test method. There are different ways of testing for the presence of THC, and different jurisdictions use different methods, even within a state. And these different methods have a minimum threshold of detection. Some have slightly more or less sensitive to the presence of THC than others, so that leads to some complications in comparing results across methods. One method that's more sensitive will show THC, and another method that's not will not. There's also differences in testing policy across states. Some states test every driver involved in a fatal crash. Other states don't. So when comparing states, there's a question of reliability because they've got some policies as to who gets tested. And there's some debate about what counts as THC positive. What is the minimum threshold to say that there's enough THC present to imply impairment? There's some agreement on that, but it may vary across states too. So that's another complication in measurement. And the testing criterion, what level counts as a positive, is complicated by 3 other factors. First of all, units. The U.S. tends to use the unit of THC in whole blood, where Europe tends to focus on THC in blood serum, which is sort of a more dense, more concentrated version of the whole blood. When you test has a big impact, as we've already discussed. The fact that THC is fat soluble, it gets stored in fat. As we saw some of those graphs, THC can be present long after the subjective effect or observable impairment. So the timing of the test is important. especially when testing of drivers may happen several hours afterwards. Those tests may underestimate the amount of impairment. And just because there's THC present when they are tested does not mean they're impaired at that moment, even though they could have been earlier on. And as we also discussed, the THC level, its impact or consequences may be different whether it's on the absorption phase or the elimination phase of the cycle. And the last one's interesting. There's some research looking at the effect of what's called post-mortem distribution. A living human being who's taken THC, the THC is being moved around the body through the blood circulatory system. The fatally injured driver, there's no longer any movement of blood through the system. And there's some evidence showing that in those situations, the THC redistributes through the body without the movement of the blood. So you get higher concentrations of THC in certain regions of the body. So the results you get from a post-mortem test of THC could depend on how long after death the test is taken and where the blood is drawn from. So the whole measurement area is quite complicated in and of itself. Now I want to move to some of the logic of how cannabis affects the body and influences crash risk. And we'll use this logic here. Cannabis accessibility leads to cannabis use, which can affect brain functioning affects cognitive functioning affects driving because driving is based on cognitive functioning, and impaired driving can lead to crash risk. We've already talked about access changing as laws change. We've already shown some data about cannabis use. So we'll focus on the remaining parts of this logic model. Beginning with brain functioning, I don't expect you to be able to read this poster. I just want to point out that there's work going on led by Godfrey Perlson at Yale University, looking specifically at the effect of cannabis on brain functioning. We have a small role in this project, but essentially they developed a driving simulator that lets subjects drive a virtual driving route while in an MRI with measurements taken of their brain functioning at different dose levels of THC. And if you look at the literature that has examined brain functioning as a function of THC level, these are some of the main conclusions. First of all, cannabis use tends to deactivate regions of the brain that are involved with driving. So when you're on THC, your brain regions involved with driving have less activity going on. This is especially true in regions of the brain responsible for visual processing and for time estimation. Literature also shows that normally regions of our brains work together. They network to achieve complex real-world tasks. And on cannabis, this networking is disrupted. So the collaboration amongst regions of the brains is disrupted when on cannabis. And lastly, there's also some interesting suggestions that given the impairments of regions of the brain and the disrupted networking, new regions of the brain may become activated with cannabis, which there's some hypotheses this might be efforts on the brain's part to compensate for the networking disruption and the region deactivation. So cannabis does affect brain functioning. In fact, arguably this is why people consume the drug. How does brain functioning translate to cognitive function impairment? Been quite a lot of research done on this. This is a summary table provided in an article from Broyd et al. It looks at the effects under different cognitive domains, attention, memory, and psychomotor control, as well as executive functions. Executive functions are higher conscious processes like problem solving, decision making, and so forth. And here the graph or the table shows acute effects, that is the effects during right after consumption, chronic effects, the effects of people who use cannabis regularly, and persistence effects, which are the effects of chronic users who stop using cannabis. And the way this table is coded is that 3 pluses means consistent evidence across many studies. A plus and a minus means mixed evidence. And what you see, if we're focusing here really just on acute use, what's the effect on cognitive functioning when a person consumes alcohol in a session, we see that there's very strong evidence that attention, memory, and psychomotor control is impaired as a result of changes in brain functioning with acute use. Executive functions is mixed results. Problem solving, decision making may be impaired less consistently by cannabis, and the argument there is executive functions are under conscious control, so we can try harder when we feel impaired to overcome the impairment, and by conscious control, we may not have as much impact on our executive functions, including problem solving, decision making, etc. Psychomotor control, I thought it might be worth talking about an example of how this is measured to get an idea of how people measure cognitive functioning. This is an example of a study that looked at psychomotor performance, and in this task, subjects sat at a computer screen and they had rectangles pop up on the screen, and for a certain kind of rectangle, they had to tap a button with their dominant forefinger. So it's psychomotor control in the sense that you're controlling your actions in terms of visual stimuli in the environment, just like we do in driving, with respect to making inputs to the vehicle as we detect information in the driving scene. The left side of the graph shows the percent of target rectangles correctly identified, and the right graph shows the time between the correct rectangle appearing on the screen and how long it took the person to tap the button. And as you see, as you move from placebo, no THC, to a low dose, then a high dose of THC, they missed more of the correct rectangles, their correct detection went down, and they were slower to press the button. So they were slower to detect and slower to respond. It's a simple example of a psychomotor performance task that can be done in a laboratory setting. Moving on from cognitive functions, how does that actually manifest itself in actual driving? This is arguably one of the seminal studies reported by Ramacher and his colleagues that looked at subjects driving an actual car on an actual road while actually consuming alcohol and cannabis in different combinations. And what the graph shows here is the change in standard deviation of lane position. So one of the main measures people use to examine the effects of cannabis on driving is the stability of their lane position. And the reason is that maintaining lane position is a very automated task. We automatically, at least when we move from a novice to an expert driver, we unconsciously react to variability in the vehicle's position from wind gusts or the surface of the road to regain our lane position. And it's measured in terms of variability from the center lane position. And what the data shows is changes from baseline, where baseline is no alcohol and no cannabis. And we have several bars here. We have the blue bar, which is no cannabis, but 0.04 BAC. We then have 2 doses of cannabis, 100 units per kilogram, or 200, which probably is around 4% THC level in whole blood, or 6%. So we have 2 levels of THC, one without alcohol and one combined with 0.04% BAC. So we're looking here at how these subjects change from baseline, completely sober, with alcohol alone, with THC alone, or in combination with THC and alcohol. And the higher up the bar, the more variability, the more change in lane position, indicating poorer vehicle control or greater impairment. And I want to point out a couple of things here. We've also overlaid the results from similar studies that used higher BAC levels. The top dashed line is what you would find from other studies that have done the same kind of protocol at 0.10 BAC, and the lower dashed line is 0.08 BAC. And there's a couple of things to point out. Low doses of alcohol does increase lane variability. Low amounts of THC does increase lane variability. But when you combine the two together, low doses of alcohol and fairly low doses of THC, you start getting impairment equivalent to 0.08 or even 0.10. So the combination of THC, even with low levels of BAC, substantially increase impairment in driving. So here we see the examples here of just THC levels fairly moderate with low doses of BAC. You end up getting evidence of impairment much greater than 0.10. So the combination of these two drugs, especially at low levels, their synergistic effects can be quite profound. Now, another big conversation in this literature is the idea of compensation. Drivers are aware that they're impaired, so they can compensate by trying harder. And again, we turn to Raymakers, who sort of suggest that this is being overemphasized, misquoted in literature, and that there are many studies to show that drivers, even if they're aware of their impairment, cannot completely compensate. And whereas they may be able to compensate in some tasks, they can't compensate in others. And here we can go back to the lane keeping example, which is largely automatic, doesn't have conscious control. People can only compensate for things they have conscious control over. So here there's an example where they probably cannot compensate by trying harder because they have no real conscious control about this task anymore. It's a largely automated activity. So the notion of compensation is probably exaggerated and overemphasized because the vast majority of the evidence suggests that people cannot fully compensate, i.e. to completely override the impairment, and there are some tasks where they simply can't compensate because they don't have any conscious awareness of that task anymore. It's become automated. Moving on finally to crash risk. What does the evidence say there? We can look at several attributes of crash risk. First, let's look at unsafe acts. This is some data done by Dubois and his colleagues that looked at the odds or the probability of committing an unsafe act. So unsafe acts are things like speeding or some behavior related to not paying attention. It turns out that, against common conception, drivers on THC are more likely to commit a speeding act resulting in a crash than those not on THC, or rather who haven't taken cannabis. So in this graph, we have their model they created to predict the odds of committing an unsafe act as a function of BAC level and whether it was without THC or with THC. And you see in all cases, this is, for example, BAC 0, so it's just the presence of THC versus being absent. The odds of an unsafe act goes up with THC compared to no THC, showing that cannabis alone can increase the risk of committing an unsafe act while driving. But what's interesting, if you look at the increase in odds with THC present across the BAC levels, it drops. So if we make a ratio of THC present over THC absent, we get 1.17, meaning with its present is 0.17 more likely to have an unsafe act. Running down the list, the effect of THC reduces as alcohol level increases, which is to say the effect of THC on increasing the odds of an unsafe act is stronger at lower BAC levels than at higher BAC levels. And the argument is at higher BAC levels, the greater impairment effect of alcohol predominates, where at lower BAC levels, it's the impairment effect of THC that predominates. If you're making more unsafe acts when you're on cannabis, you're likely to be more responsible for the crash. And there's been a lot of research looking at this idea of culpability. What is the probability you were responsible as a driver for a crash if you had THC in your system versus not having THC in the system? And we see very clearly that as THC level increases, you are much more likely to be responsible for a crash. So THC not only influences the probability of committing an unsafe act, that translates to being more responsible for crashes that do happen. And finally, we can look at measures of the odds of being involved in a fatal crash as a function of drug. And here's some data, unadjusted odds ratios that show a variety of drugs. Cannabis has an estimate of about 1.83, ranging between 1.39 and 2.39. There are other drugs with higher levels, notably alcohol. And we see again that the odds when combining drugs with alcohol is even higher. The bottom line here is that the effect of cannabis approximately doubles the risk of a fatal crash. So let's think about that in a bit more detail. What does that data about risk really mean? A lot of the data talks about odds ratios, which is a value that can be as low as 0, but go up to any number. And generally speaking, odds ratios above 1 means the presence of the drug makes things riskier, you're more likely to have a crash, and less than 1, safer, you're less likely to have a crash. And we tend to get 3 different possible patterns of odds ratio results. Odds ratios are shown as a central estimate, a vertical line, and then a confidence interval, a range within which the true value may lie. And they're often called a 95% confidence interval because it means if you were to repeat, for example, this study 100 times, 95% of the times the true odds would be within this range. So sometimes we get results like this where you've got a central value estimate within the red and so are the brackets. And that tells us with some confidence level that THC increases the risk of a fatal crash. There are times when you get a central estimate within the red, but the barrier, the brackets include the green. And this is often mistakenly interpreted to mean there is no increase in risk resulting from THC. Technically, that's not the true interpretation. The true interpretation is there's simply no evidence that THC increases risk. This is a null hypothesis that the drug has no effect. You never prove the null hypothesis. You just fail to find evidence to reject it. And sometimes you may even find a central estimate in the green where the brackets are in the green too, which suggests that THC decreases risk. And looking at the literature overall, there are a few cases where there's no evidence that THC increases risk, but the vast majority of cases show there is an increase in risk. And there's never been a case of THC improving risk or reducing risk or making people safer. And you can look at meta-analyses that have looked at different studies and try to use advanced statistics to get some averaging across multiple studies. Here's an example from Lee et al. Many of these studies are actually adjusted for age and gender, but there's only one that is less than 1, and that's the one near the bottom. This particular meta-analysis came up with an average across multiple studies of an odds ratio from THC increasing fatal crash risk of 2.66. So this sort of confirms that our estimate in the previous table may be accurate. Now, I mentioned that the table I showed was unadjusted, and the meta-analysis included examples of adjusting odds ratios. And what adjusting means is that people take the odds ratio and adjust for the gender and age and other demographics of the drivers involved. And the reason people do that is they recognize that age and gender may relate to unsafe driving and cannabis use, so that if you are looking for the effect of cannabis use, you may be also capturing the risk of being, for example, male and young. So they try and take out the effect of gender and age. But I think people often misinterpret what the resulting odds ratio means. They may misinterpret what the adjusted odds ratio means. So in this case, adjusting for gender, here we have a blue versus green age 20 and 24, the graph here is fatal crashes per 100,000 licensed drivers in each age group. You see that males are much more dangerous than females. So adjusting for gender is how you would look at that difference. Here you can also look at age effects. Here we see that males 20-24 are much more dangerous than males 50 to 59. And when people are adjusting for age and gender effects with these odd ratios involving THC crash risk, what they're saying is the gender effect and the age effect is greater than the effect of cannabis. The risk associated with gender, male versus female, and the risk associated with age, being young versus being old, is greater than the estimated effect of cannabis. But it's not saying cannabis has no risk. For example, if you look at this data, which tries to model the odds of being in a fatal crash, sorry, in this case, it's the odds of being a driver committing an unsafe act, which we've just shown can lead to fatal crashes. These authors separated the odds of drivers committing unsafe acts in terms of THC present or absent. So here we have 8 people aged 25 years. Here we have people aged 45 years. Here we have people aged 65 years. And on the bottom axis, we have combination with alcohol. Let's focus at 0. So we're just looking at the increased odds of having THC present with no alcohol. And in each of these age groups, there's 2 lines. The top line in each pairing is THC present. The bottom line is THC absent. And in all cases, you see 25-year-old with THC present has a higher risk of an unsafe act than a 25-year-old without it present. Same thing with 45-year-olds, same thing with 65-year-olds. So adjusting for age does not mean THC has no effect. Any person with THC present will have a greater odds of an unsafe act than one without it. It just means the age effect may be bigger than the risk associated with THC. And this other graph shows another study that compared the odd ratios for people 25 and younger versus all age groups. And again, you see young people with THC present have a higher odds than all age groups with THC present. So just to make sure we're clear on this, younger people do have a higher odds ratio, but they also have a much higher odds ratio when they have THC present as well. I want to talk about the notion of harm briefly. As opposed to risk. Risk is the probability of something happening. Harm is the outcome of that thing happening. And how much harm is present depends on how many people are exposed to the risk. So if we go back to this graph we looked at earlier that shows the odds of being involved in a fatal crash as a function of drug type, here we have a measure of risk. Odd ratios you can think of as a measure of risk. So if we take the example of depressants, but a risk odds ratio of about 5, and we measure how many people use depressants, we can come up with a sort of proxy measure for how much harm there might be. So here, 2.4% of people aged 12 and older reported using depressants in 2018. This is Sansa data. So if you multiply these two together, you get this sort of proxy harm value of 12. If you look at cannabis, the risk is much lower than depressants, but the exposure is much higher, which means you get a much higher predicted harm. It's not all about the risk. It's also about the exposure to that risk. And there are many more people using cannabis, which has a lower risk than other drugs, but the higher exposure means there's more harm. And in fact, when you read this study, you can see that depressants, their risk from depressants was 2.6 times greater than cannabis, but there were nearly twice as many fatally injured THC-positive drivers. So even though depressants has a higher risk, there are many more fatally injured THC-positive drivers than those positive for depressants. So we need to consider exposure, too, to think about harm and not just focus on risk. And finally, when we think about the risk, aside from looking at the numbers, we also need to keep in mind that we have evidence that the logic connecting the drug to brain functions, to cognitive functions, to driving impairment, to crash risk, we have evidence for this entire logic. And it's important to appreciate that having evidence for every step in the logic should be seen as another way of thinking about the importance of cannabis in traffic safety. Finally, I want to talk about the effects of laws in society on crash risk. There's a number of studies out there that have looked at the effects of laws on traffic fatalities, comparing states with legalized laws versus those without. And the important thing to consider is what is the design in testing the hypothesis that legalizing laws increases traffic fatalities. A simple comparison between laws, states with the laws and states without the laws, doesn't lead to a conclusion that the law was the cause of the effect. So even if we have this bar graph for traffic fatalities, it does not mean the red states have more fatalities because of the law. It simply could mean that that state has a higher degree of younger drivers than the green states you compared it to. Or the green states had a GDL law that made them safer compared to the comparison red state. So you could also do before and after the law came into play. You could compare a state that has a law now to how they performed before the law came into effect. But that still doesn't give you a definitive conclusion that it's a law that was the result. You could find that when the law came into effect, socioeconomic conditions also improved, so people were driving more and therefore had more exposure and more likely to have crashes. And this could be part of a trend that's been going on for a while. If we look further back into time, we could see a trend in how fatalities are happening in these states, the actual states with laws and the comparison states, irrespective of what's happening with laws coming into play. So when you talk about best practices, what's the best design to make causal inferences about the effects of laws on traffic safety? And this is what we believe to be the best practice design for trying to isolate the effect of cannabis laws on traffic safety. It's called the difference in difference method. And what you essentially do is you track the states you care about that will have laws in place or eventually had laws in place over multiple years, so you can develop a model, a linear model, which predicts the trend in fatalities in the before law period. You do the same with your comparison states. You come up with a model that predicts their trend in the before law period, and then you compare what those models would predict happen in the future without the law with what you actually find. So you are not comparing directly a state to a comparison state. You're comparing the state actual fatalities to what your model predicts if the same trend continued before the law went into effect. This helps remove a lot of those other factors that are confounding with the law and lets you make a more definitive statement about the effect of a law on fatalities and identify that law as having a causal effect. Unfortunately, there's been too few studies using this method for us to be able to make a definitive statement about what the effects of laws are. Part of this because only a few states collect data in a comparable way about THC in drivers. That's Washington State and possibly Colorado. So before we can use this method, we maybe need to think about how we're collecting data so that we can look at the effects across multiple states, not just one or two. Finally, in this project, we were asked to think about what are the social effects of changing laws, and we did a survey question in a previous study which asked people in Washington State how they're interpreting the legalization of cannabis. And the question was, do you disagree or agree with the statement that the legalization of cannabis implied that it is safe to drive under the influence? And most people said it didn't, but there's about 20% of respondents who thought the legalization of cannabis meant it was safe to drive after using it, which is quite a profound misinterpretation. And it's important because those that thought it meant it was safe to drive were 1.5 times more likely to drive after using cannabis themselves. So this social misinterpretation of the law did have an important impact on the decisions people made who misinterpreted the implication of that law. And with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention. I know there's a lot of information there. I draw your attention to the project website, which gives you a link to the report as well as all the tools. I invite you to look in more detail into the information provided in the report and invite you to see how the tools may help you with your individual needs to understand and communicate the importance of cannabis as a traffic safety topic. Thank you, everyone. We'll try and take a few questions in the few minutes remaining, but we're also open to having any questions emailed to us after the webinar closes.
I don't see any questions in the questions box. If you do have a question, please enter it in the questions box. Kelly, if I'm understanding correct, that's the method to ask a question by typing it in versus doing a verbal, or do we have capability for a verbal question?
I can unmute individual people if they click the little raised hand icon, but then also the chat box works just as well. And so either way would be fine.
Right, and I'm not seeing any questions at this point. Oh, there's one. So Nick, are there any confounding effects discovered for non-gender/age categories? Example, education, income, etc.
The people who adjust their odd ratios often include a lot of different demographics, including socioeconomic and education. But the main ones that people focus on are gender and age. And those are the ones that we probably have the best evidence to look at to see how gender and age actually interact with cannabis use and crash risk. So there's not much information about the other ones as there are about age and gender. Those seem to be the ones that people focus on the most, given that we know that males, young males in particular, are inherently more risky anyway and seem to be the ones more involved in illicit drug use and the ones that are overrepresented in fatally injured drivers. I do see a question, Sue, about will the slides be made available. There are a subset of slides available in the tool set on the website. And I believe this is being recorded, so that you'll also be able to have access to the slide information from the recorded webinar, too.
All right, thank you, Nick. We have another question. How does the fact that there's a limit on the percentage of THC allowed in studies impact the application of the studies to high THC products?
Excellent question. Very good question. One of the difficulties in doing this research is if you're doing the research within, for example, an institute or a university setting in the U.S., there are limits to where you can get your cannabis source from federal sources, and those federal sources don't necessarily reflect the amount of THC present in current strains of cannabis available to the public. So I suspect from the results you see, you have an upper limit to how much THC is present. So if anything, the evidence in the literature may be underestimating the amount of impairment present. The evidence regarding crash risk, where you're sampling from drivers in the real environment, they're free to use any kind of drug or any kind of cannabis. So you may be finding in those samples the higher levels from the more modern strains. But in the experimental settings, those tend to be restricted strains at lower THC levels. There are some people who are trying to develop methodologies where you are engaging with subjects on their own time and in their own place and their own cannabis sources rather than being in experimental settings. But those are fairly new, but would give us more insight into what the effects might be of these higher THC dose cannabis strains might be. There is the assumption that people called self-titrate, that they basically, even with a higher THC level strain, they restrict how much they consume to target a specific level of high. Their assumption that people manage their intake, even with higher potency cannabis strains, to maintain a desired high level, which would stay the same. So if they were consuming a lower strength cannabis strain, they may smoke more than they would if they were smoking a higher potency THC strain, where they would moderate and probably smoke less. There's a hypothesis around that people moderate their intake. So the effect of strain may be moderated by this moderation.
So I know we're at time, but we do have a couple more questions. It would be nice to have them recorded with the webinar if we have a couple more minutes. The next question is, for the oral dose study in which the peak times varied greatly, were the subjects similar in body composition, gender?
Great question. They were similar, but they deliberately were selected to be somewhat varied, and that's the sort of source of the variability. Just like with alcohol, there's some variation in the intoxication resulting from alcohol based on body mass and gender. It's probably the same for THC level 2.
Okay, the last question we have here, will you be providing specific examples of or resources geared towards messaging to avoid psychological reactance and moral disengagement associated with DUIC, or do you believe the messaging would be similar as that with DUI alcohol prevention?
We're actually involved with another pooled fund project, which is investigating psychological reactance and moral disengagement generally across all messaging types. We are involved in some other research projects around DUIC, which is exploring this question in more detail. How would you communicate to a cannabis using population versus an alcohol using population? Our suspicion is that they would be different messages. They would be different messages because the cultural beliefs driving cannabis use are different than the cultural beliefs driving alcohol use. And the two different populations might be more or less prone to reactance anyway. So we would need to consider the particular beliefs of DUIC compared to alcohol, which may lead to different messaging, and anticipate, or at least explore the possibility that there may be differences in proneness to reactance between the two groups, which may also require different strategies for messaging.
Thank you, Nick. I don't have any other typed in questions. Kelly, do you have any raised hands?
Yeah, we had a couple come in through chat. It looks like as on the slide that compared the 3 individuals, did they share similar or different characteristics?
Yes, I think we had a similar question to that. They were not selected to be identical to each other.
Question is, does crash risk increase with higher concentrations of THC?
Yes. The higher the THC level, the more likely you are to commit an unsafe act, the more likely you are to be responsible, and the more likely is that crash to be fatal. It's a similar curve to alcohol, but it's estimated more than it is actually quantified, like the curve has been done for alcohol, which was used to justify 0.08 as a limit.
The next question is, what efforts are underway to standardize evidence collection methods for law enforcement?
I do not have a good answer for that. I know there's been a lot of effort made to come up with a standard threshold for THC, and that involved a lot of input from law enforcement. But other than that, I'm not familiar with what's happening on the law enforcement side specifically.
So I want to thank everybody for your participation and for staying late. We'll send out an email to all the registrants when the recording and the presentation is posted. Thank you so much for your interest.